Most of us are familiar, aren't we, with the idea of original sin. That is the Christian mythological idea that we're all guilty because a talking snake persuaded Eve to take a bite of an apple, and she then persuaded Adam to take a bite of an apple that gave them knowledge and understanding and all the wonderful things that actually make us human. At least that's according to the myth. And it's ironic because it's usually men giving women gifts in order to get them to take a bite out of their snake, if you follow. Now, I've never really understood why this was such an easy sell to Christians, because it's an outrage to fairness, which even monkeys can understand. So, quite why people would fall for this, I have no particular idea. The idea that you carry guilt for what someone else has done, let alone someone who has putatively been dead for thousands upon thousands of years, is just absurd on its face. You know, if you and your brother were left alone in the house and he smashed a vase, why should you be held accountable for it? You know, it doesn't make any sense. You know, the other person is the one that did the wrong. You know, especially if you weren't even around to be the one that did the wrong. It just makes no sense to hold you accountable. And I think in most people, when you take that out of that religious context, where for some reason they excuse it, I think it outrages most people's senses of justice. And yet we also find a secular version of original sin, originating in various gender and racial and other kinds of studies, where you are held accountable for the actions of people in the past who happen to share a certain, not really related trait with you, or you are held collectively accountable for the things that a handful of people that share these irrelevant traits with you have done. So, for being cisgender, you are held accountable for anything that anyone else cisgender has ever done to anyone transgender. As a heterosexual, you're seemingly held accountable for everything anyone has ever done to anyone who is homosexual. As a white, you're collectively held accountable for anything anyone has ever done to anyone who is not white. As a man, you're held accountable collectively and historically for everything that men have ever done to women. And none of this is any more acceptable than the mythological transferal of guilt that occurs in Christianity, and yet people take it seriously. People treat it as if this isn't an outrage to morality, as if this isn't an ethical transgression of how we should be treating each other. And it's never acceptable in the reverse, quite rightly. We should not hold all black people accountable for the actions of a handful of drug dealers and murderers and thugs any more than we should hold all white people for the actions of the white versions of these things. None of it makes any sense. It is a moral outrage. It confounds our natural sense of justice, and yet they find ways to excuse it. And the irony of it is that this plays into the persecution complexes of the identitarian movements that these people would be against. The white identity movements, the ones that want to try and claim that whites are somehow being persecuted or whatever. This kind of behaviour, this kind of philosophy, this kind of excuse making adds fuel to that fire. It makes their absurd claims of white genocide seem slightly credible. It makes their claims of being discriminated against and abused seem more credible, and in some cases they're actually true in the cases of preferential hiring and so on. And this only feeds these identity movements that these other identity movements are appalled by and horrified and want to stop. So there's a horrible irony to the whole thing. And still none of it makes any sense. Why should I be held accountable for the actions of my ancestors? And odds are not my ancestors. When we take the slavery question, for example, it was the 1% of the day that could afford to have and operate slaves. It wasn't ordinary folk, it wasn't 99% of people. You could argue that we all benefit from the wealth that helps produce for our countries and help make them more powerful, but anyone living here draws advantage from that, no matter their colour. So everyone is equally guilty on that score. It just, none of it makes any sense, and it's incredibly unfair. And it's interesting to see how, even without religion, people seem to find this mechanism for transferring guilt from one generation to another, no matter how unfair or how stupid it is. And if you're going to hold us accountable for things that our ancestors, who had nothing to do with us, if you're going to hold us accountable for the bad things that they did, then that only adds to the argument that, again, the white identitarians have, that we should be proud of things that we never did either. You know, we didn't collectively as white people invent liberal democracy. We didn't collectively as white people invent the scientific method or whatever else. But, you know, these white identitarians will claim this in the same way that you try to push collective and historical guilt onto them. It's just self-defeating, irrational, illogical, and should be rejected for exactly the same reasons we reject it from religion. Zang.